you can't really write any code without using variables, right? So how do we introduce variables in our code? We use variable declarations. That's what we call the idea of introducing a variable. We declare the variable. So I want to talk about variable declarations in JavaScript and what are the things that you need to know. What are the things that are useful to know about when it comes to variable declarations? So we're going to do a quick tour of what that really means. I want to start with a first thing. Variable declarations are statements. Now, a statement is a piece of code, and a program in JavaScript is composed of some number of statements. Now, I bring this up just to make the distinction that there's a difference between statements and expressions. Expressions evaluate to a value when they are executed, but statements, they're more like a way to tell the computer something, to tell it to perform some action, and really, when we're declaring a variable, we're telling the computer, hey, we're going to start using this variable, and this is what it's going to be called, and possibly this is the initial value that we want to put into that variable from the start. Now, when we look at examples of variable declarations, well, here I wrote down 3 declarations. These are variable declaration statements, okay? And I'm actually using 3 different keywords that you can use to declare these variables, and that's the var keyword, then we have let, and we have const. We're going to look at the difference between the 3 actually. But before we do that, I want to just point out a little bit about the anatomy of a variable declaration. So we have a keyword on the left. In fact, this is the variable declaration keyword. But what we have on the right here is worth noting that this is an assignment expression. And the reason why it's an assignment is because here we're actually assigning a value to this variable as it's declared. So, in fact, behind the scenes, 2 things happen at once. They're 2 separate things, but in one variable declaration, we can make both things happen at once. And that is, on the one hand, we are declaring the variable. We are basically telling the computer that this is the name of the variable that we will be using. And then the second thing that happens in one statement, really on one line, the second thing that happens is that we are giving that variable a value. We are right away assigning a value to that variable. And this further breaks down into this on the right, which is any expression. So this is an expression, a sub-expression, which could be anything. Right here we have a literal number, 42, but it could be any expression at all. And on the left here, what we have is, well, the identifier that we're going to be using. It's an identifier, meaning that it's the name of a variable. There are more complex forms of a variable declaration where it's not just an identifier. And I'm talking about things like destructuring patterns. We're not going to talk about that right now because that's beyond the scope. But if you're using destructuring, then you can have a variable declaration that is actually a lot more complicated than just this. So we're going to stick to just this simple case for now. But there are a couple of other forms. In fact, you don't necessarily have to assign an initial value to a variable at all. Here I have a few examples with the let keyword. And the first one here, I want to point out that we can do this. We don't need to give it a value. If I'm declaring this variable a, I can just omit entirely an initial value. Now, what that really means? Well, it means that the value, there will be a value. There's no such thing as no value in a variable. But because we didn't give it any actual value, then JavaScript is going to put the value of undefined. Undefined is going to be the value of this variable. So if we just don't tell the computer what to put in there, it's going to put that there on its own. That's really the kind of a default state of a variable that never was initialized. It's undefined. I also want to point out the fact that in one variable declaration, you can have multiple variables declared, and in fact, multiple variables declared and assigned to in one statement, in one line even. This is the equivalent, exactly the equivalent of putting them in separate declarations. And it becomes a matter of style which one you prefer. Now I'll give you my opinion. I prefer to give each of these its own line. So I prefer the second example. Why? Because it's more readable. When I'm jumping into some code that I'm not familiar with or that I don't remember well, then I want to be able to tell at a glance what are the variables that are being used. Because that's the minimum information that I need to be able to read some code, is to get some context. What are the variables that are being used here? And when each of the variables has its own line, then I can immediately tell at a glance not only what they're called because they're nicely arranged in a column, but also at a glance you can see how many there are, so I can get a sense of what's going on. If you put them all on one line, well, what you do is you're saving some space, but you're not actually making it more readable, and that's why, in my opinion, I like to do that. I like to put them on their own lines. So let's continue with this theme that we started with, the fact that there are 3 different keywords. There are 3 different ways to declare a variable. What's up with that? Why do we even have that? I mean, I hate it when programming languages introduce more complexity than is necessary, right? When they make things too complicated. So is that the case here? Why do we have 3 different keywords? And is that complicated, or actually can we think of this in as simple a way as possible? Well, let's actually look at the 3 and let's discuss what we know about them. So the var keyword, it is the original keyword that has existed in JavaScript since the beginning. In fact, before the standard that we call ECMAScript 6, or now often we call it ECMAScript 2015, that's just another name for the same standard. That's all we had. So before that, we had only var. And var is short for variable. That's pretty straightforward, right? It's not a very original name. It's like the obvious thing you would call a keyword like this. It's short because we use it a lot, so they just decided, let's call it var, the shortest thing possible that refers to the word variable. But then ECMAScript 6 showed up, and this new standard introduced 2 new keywords, let and const. Now, there is a distinction between what let is, but let is basically the typical declaration that you would use, like for just any variable, and const is where they introduced a bit of a nuance. So whereas let is almost a replacement for var, and there is a distinction, actually, there is a difference between var and let, and that's the way that the keyword treats variable scope. But I don't want to talk about that here because that's also outside of this video. But suffice it to say that the interesting thing was the introduction of const, which is short for constant. So it implies that rather than a true variable, we want to declare a constant. And in a minute, we're going to look at whether that's actually accurate, whether things declared with const, are they actually constants? We'll take a look at that. But so that's easy, right? It's easy to see that const comes from the word constant. But the word let, what is up with that, right? You see the word let, it doesn't seem to have anything to do with a var. It doesn't seem to have, it doesn't seem to be a short form of a word like constant. So what's up with it? Well, let actually comes from maybe originally from mathematics, from just this expression where you say let some variable x be equal to some value, be equal to. It's this phrase that we might use in mathematics, and it's a phrase that found its way into computer science. And JavaScript isn't the first language to use let. That's why they picked this keyword, because other programming languages, there's a bunch of them, they use let as a keyword to introduce a variable. And that's it. It's really just the start of this phrase when we're saying, really just saying, let this variable be equal to something. So that's really all it is. Is it true that let is for variables and const is for constants? Well, the question isn't really exact enough. So I'm going to replace it with this question. Can I reassign a value? So suppose we actually assign some value to this variable. What if later in my code, like a few lines later, I change my mind and I decide to assign a new value to it. Can I do that? Well, with the let keyword, yes. Yes, I can. However, if I were to do the same with const, turns out that no, this is the difference. So I cannot reassign. Once I assign something with the const keyword, once I create that variable, I cannot reassign it to something else later. And that's the purpose of the const the const declaration. That's the purpose. We can't reassign another value to it. So that's what they mean by constant in the language. However, what do you normally think of when you think of constant? It's something that doesn't change, right? That's what the word constant means. If something remains constant, then it doesn't change. So is that what we mean here? It's a little bit tricky because it's not the full story. It's not that we can't modify. We actually can. So suppose I have an object, or maybe let's call it an array. Suppose I have an array like this with a few values. And later on, after this initial declaration, I might say, okay, the value at the index 2, I actually want to make it equal to something else. So I'm modifying this array. I could be doing the same thing with an object. I might be modifying one of the properties of the object. Am I allowed to do this? Well, with the let keyword, yes. But here's where it's funny. With the const keyword, yes, also. It turns out that can I modify? The answer is yes for both. But as we just saw, can I reassign is where the difference actually lies. That's it. So it makes it pretty simple to remember. The only thing that is constant about variables that are declared with the const keyword is that you can't reassign to them. But you can modify the members of an array that's in the variable. You can modify the properties of an object. So that's the difference. That's it. And that's why the const keyword was introduced, so that we could have a variable, a type of variable that cannot be reassigned. Now, why would you want that? What's the point of introducing this? Like I just said, I mean, I don't like it when things are introduced into the language for no reason, right? So why did they introduce the const keyword? The reason is that it's actually a useful thing to know about a variable, whether or not it's ever going to be reassigned to a new value. So this is useful both for the computer and also for readers. It's useful for the computer in the hypothetical situation that you might be able to optimize some things if you know for a fact that it's never going to be possible for a new value to be assigned, to be reassigned to that variable. Now, whether those optimizations actually matter is, I don't even actually know. It's beyond my expertise. But the other argument that's made is that for the reader of the code, it's useful to know. It's useful to be able to label a variable as a const, so that you know that it's not going to change what's assigned to it later on. Now, you might still know, okay, so if it's an array, then it might be modified. If it's an object, then it also might be modified somewhere down the road in the code. But at least I know that we won't have it get reassigned with a new value. And that is valuable. That's valuable when you have a lot of code that you haven't fully read or that you don't remember, for example. It's just a useful extra piece of information that tells you something about what's going to happen later on in the code. And another way of looking at it is it's an expression of intent. The programmer who writes const is saying to future readers of the code, hey, my intent is that we're not going to reassign something to this variable. So that's great to know, because it's a way we can communicate something about our code that tells us a bit more about the intent of the person who wrote it. Now, I want to go a little bit deeper, because what does this mean? What does this mean that we cannot reassign? It means that once we assign initially, it has to stay assigned to that value, and that affects what happens to this initial declaration, right? We were looking at the fact that with let we can basically assign it to something right away, but we can also not. We can just have a let a, which then, like we said, is going to be under the hood, is going to be assigned with this value of undefined. But can we do that with const? Well, we're limited to this. We can't actually do that with const, because as soon as we were to just say const a, then it would always stay undefined because we can't reassign. And that would be a useless variable. We don't have any use for a variable where it just starts out as undefined and then it's undefined forever. Because you literally cannot do anything with that undefined, because you can't replace it with a value that's actually, that actually equals some value. That's why we cannot do this. This is a limitation of const. You cannot just write const a or const any name. You actually have to write const and then initialize that a with some value. So that's a side effect of the const being a sort of constant. If you look in other programming languages, I just want to end with this side note. You're going to find a different definition of constant. You're going to have most programming languages that really, when they say constant, they mean a variable that can't change. So it's not a variable then, right? It's a constant. That's the opposite of variable. It's constant. That's literally the opposite of what the word means, right? But in JavaScript, we're bending the definition a little bit, and we're using this idea of constant in not a full constant sense. So if you go into other programming languages where they do have actual constants, then you'll find that not only can you not reassign those constants, but additionally you can't modify them at all. They really are read-only constants. That's really what we mean in those languages. And in JavaScript, it's not the case. We're bending the truth a little bit. But is the constant, this idea of constants in JavaScript, or at least of the const keyword, is this idea still useful? Absolutely. Like we said, it's a useful idea. It's really a good habit of using const whenever possible. And I'll tell you my recommendation. My recommendation is use const whenever possible, always, really, unless you need to reassign a variable. And then if you need to reassign, then use a let. Well, at that point, basically, when you realize that you're going to need to reassign that variable, then change the declaration from const to a let, and now you'll be able to do that, and it also will signal in the code to the readers of your code, or even to yourself in the future, that the variables that don't need to change, we're using const to indicate that. And then if we do have a variable declared with let, then it's like a signal then that says, hey, there's something special about this variable, because unlike the others, which are consts, this one will be reassigned. So maybe pay attention to that one and look at it differently than the other variables in the code. And that's what I do. I always start out, before I know what I'm going to be doing with the variables, I just start out by defining all of them as const. And then I just later adapt if I find out that I will need to reassign. That's the way I do it. That's my habit when it comes to variable declarations.